Hey guys, it's James back again with another repair video on the Honda Odyssey. Today's job is a valve adjustment on this 3.5 liter Honda engine. There's no real special tools required in this other than a set of feeler gauges. You really only need two size feeler gauges depending on the application. A 10 millimeter jam nut tool will make this job a little bit easier, as well as a stubby flathead screwdriver and an offset 10 millimeter wrench. So I'm doing this a little bit out of order as I was shooting the spark plug video, which was the video prior to this one, at the same time as doing the valve adjustment and valve covers. Normally I would pull the intake before doing anything else, but I'm starting here with the ignition coils. You can do it either way. The ignition coils in the back of the engine or on the left side of the engine. The one closest to the firewall will be obviously easier to remove once the intake is off. That's the way we'll be doing it, or the way I'll show you how to do it. I didn't quite do it that way, like I said, just because I was shooting the spark plugs as a separate video. Okay, I'm going to try and speed through the first part of this process because the important part is obviously adjusting the valves. Everything leading up to that you should be able to do on your own, and if not, then you probably shouldn't be adjusting the valves. The camera angles will get better as we proceed through the repair, and we can get into more detail on what actually needs to be removed from the intake in order to get it removed from the engine. Okay, I like to start by getting the air filter box and its tube out of the way. Anything connector wise and or hose wise that you can get out of the way, and go ahead and get the throttle cables out of the way. At this point, what you're trying to do is get everything disconnected that is easy to get to. Once the intake is unbolted, we will get to the more difficult things. Okay, there's a few hoses here in the back that we can get to, and some hoses here on the throttle body that we can get to. After that, what we want to do is go ahead and remove this top plate from the upper intake. Okay, once the plate's out of the way, we will be looking at some 12 millimeter nuts and bolts. So go ahead and loosen up all the bolts and remove the nuts. You can leave the bolts in for now, but get the nuts and whatever washers may be under the nuts out of the way. And once that is done, go ahead and pull the intake out of its place. Okay, now that that's done, we've got a few little tidbits here, a couple hoses down here that we couldn't get to before. Go ahead and remove those hoses. With all the hoses out of the way, go ahead and remove the intake. You will want to cover the holes in the lower intake manifold in order to prevent anything foreign from falling in. Alright, let's remove the valve covers. We can start by removing the brackets that hold the little harnesses on. Go ahead and pull that out of the way. Let's get rid of this coolant hose here. Okay, next it's all about bolts. Remove the 10 millimeter bolts from the valve cover. Remove the valve cover. Okay, next repeat the process for the rear valve cover. But don't forget about the coils. Okay, next remove the wheel closest to the front of the engine where the belts are located. In this case, the passenger side. You'll see an access hole in the splash shield. This will allow you to pass a 19 millimeter socket and extension through to the crankshaft pulley bolt. We will need access to this bolt in order to rotate the engine over while we are adjusting the valves. Alright, let's slow it down a little bit because it is time for the important part, which is actually adjusting the valves. We'll look here at the front of the timing cover, the front of the engine here. We'll want to remove the dipstick, and we'll notice this little rubber plug. So this access hole will give you a view of the front of the camshaft gear. On the camshaft gear there's going to be a series of numbers. The numbers indicate the cylinders to which you are on top dead center. This is important because the valve adjustments are made per cylinder when that cylinder is on its top dead center. As we rotate the crankshaft, the camshaft will move respectively, and we will see a number appear through this access hole. When you see this number, align the mark on the camshaft gear with the pointer on the inside of the timing cover. This will indicate that you are in the correct position to adjust the valves on that cylinder. It doesn't matter what cylinder you start with, just start with the one that appears first. In this case, we will be starting with cylinder number 1. Okay, how do you know which cylinder is which? Well, I have a printout here that shows which cylinder is which. This is the 3.5 liter Honda. This is a 2004 Odyssey, but this motor is used in a lot of Hondas, so this will apply to essentially every Honda 3.5 liter V6. Okay, just to give you a frame of reference, here is the intake manifold still installed. We can kind of see here, looking at the front of the engine, the back of the engine, we know what's cylinders 1 through 6. Okay, now that you know what cylinder is what, you need to know what valve is what. So each cylinder has 2 intake valves and 2 exhaust valves. Each intake valve has its own specification for lash, and the exhaust valve has its own specification for valve lash. So we're looking here at the head closest to the radiator. So this is going to be cylinders 4, 5, and 6. You can see here with the arrow, that's the front of the engine. To the left, that's where the belts are at. The intake valves are marked with the red circles, and the exhaust valves are marked with the yellow circles. So it's pretty easy to kind of grasp the fact that the intake valves are closer to the intake manifold and the exhaust valves are closer to the exhaust manifold. So if we flip this over, the back cylinder head is a mirror image of the front cylinder head. We can see here that the front of the engine is still in the same spot. The exhaust manifold, however, is in the opposite spot, and the intake manifold is still in the center. The exhaust valves are still with the yellow circles. The intake valves are still with the red circles. Okay, we'll take a look at the specs for the intake and exhaust valve lash adjustments here in just a second, but take a look here again at the red and yellow circles. The circles actually are circling the jam nuts. These are the nuts that will loosen when we're adjusting the valves. These aren't actually circling the valves themselves, just the nuts that we're going to need to loosen. So get a good look at those and you'll know what you're looking for when we get to the actual valve adjustment. Okay, we're looking here now at the specs for the valve lash. Yours may vary slightly, so you definitely want to look this up to make sure. But here on this 2004 Odyssey, we're looking at 8 to 9 thousandths on the intake valves and 11 to 13 thousandths on the exhaust valves. So for this valve adjustment, we will need either an 8 or a 9 thousandths of an inch feeler gauge for the intake valves, and either an 11, 12, or 13 thousandths of an inch feeler gauge for the exhaust valves. So we're starting with number 1 cylinder, which is the closest cylinder to the front of the engine by the belts and the closest to the firewall. Okay, so it doesn't matter if you do the exhaust or the intake valves first. I'm going to be starting with the exhaust valves, so I'll use the larger of the feeler gauges. Now this is basically just like gapping a spark plug, other than it's more difficult to get to. It's essentially the same. What we want to do is drag the feeler gauge between the rocker arm and the top of the valve, and we want a certain amount of drag, just like when you're gapping a spark plug and you slide the feeler gauge or the gapper tool in between the gap and the spark plug and you feel a certain amount of drag. If you don't feel any drag or barely any drag, then you know it's too loose. If you feel way too much drag, like it's really hard to get the gauge out, then you know it's too tight. So before we loosen the nut on the rocker arm, we want to actually check it first to see if it's already okay, because it may be okay, and then we won't have to make an adjustment at all. Okay, so when you're sliding the feeler gauge back and forth to check the valve lash, you want the part that's actually in between the rocker and the valve to be as straight as possible, because if you have it angled in any certain way, it's gonna feel like it has probably more drag than it actually does. So try and keep that part straight. So what I like to do is just move it back and forth a bunch of times, as you see me doing now. I'm just trying to move it back and forth to make sure that I have it straight, and just to make sure for sure that it's exactly where I want it. So this valve actually feels pretty good. This is why you check them before you actually loosen anything, because it may be okay and you won't have to make the adjustment. I feel comfortable with the amount of drag, so I'm going to move on to the next valve. So this valve actually feels pretty good too, and I'm gonna leave it here for this valve. But typically what you'll notice on Hondas is that the exhaust valves are usually really tight and the intake valves are really loose. Now this is especially true on engines that have never had a valve adjustment. If it has relatively low miles, or you're doing this before the valve adjustment is actually due, then that might be different. But typically on engines that haven't had the valve adjusted, then the exhaust valves will usually be too tight and the intake valves will usually be too loose. So, as you can probably tell, this valve is way too loose. See how easily the feeler gauge moves back and forth? Way too loose. Alright, so here's where we actually get into the adjustment of the valves. This is where that special tool that I told you about, the jam nut tool, will come in handy, assuming that you have the room for it. Now, you can't use this on all the valves because you won't have room for it on all the valves. So that's where a stubby flathead screwdriver and a 10 millimeter offset wrench will come in handy. But you use it if you can because it makes it easier. So here's the tool. We'll slide it here over the jam nut. The screwdriver part of the tool will go into the screwdriver slot on the valve adjuster. We'll loosen the nut, and then we'll turn the valve adjuster in clockwise. Will be tightening the valve. Counterclockwise will loosen the valve. So just to clarify, the slotted part that you put the screwdriver in is actually what loosens or tightens the valve. The hexagonal part, which is the nut, that's the part that just tightens it down so it won't move again. So if it's too loose, we'll turn the screwdriver part of the adjuster, we'll turn that clockwise, so that'll tighten it. If it's too tight, we'll turn it counterclockwise, that'll loosen it up. Once we're satisfied, or we just want to try it and check, we'll tighten the nut itself down and then recheck it with the feeler gauge. So right now I'm tightening the nut down. I'm going to check it again. It's way too tight. I can't pull the feeler gauge out, so we'll need to loosen it and try again. Okay, once you are satisfied with the adjustment of that first set of valves, then we'll turn the engine over counterclockwise on Hondas and see where our cam gear is here, and the next cylinder is going to be cylinder number 6. I usually use the mirror to check it just to make sure that the pointer is lined up with the mark on the cam gear, and verify that the number is what I think it is, and I see that that's 6 and the pointer is lined up with the mark. So let's go ahead and adjust the valves on cylinder number 6. So I'm checking the intake valves here first, and as usual per Hondas, the intake valve's too loose. So see how easily it slides back and forth. So let's go ahead and adjust that. Okay, you'll see a better view here of the 10 millimeter jam nut tool. You'll just slide the screwdriver part into the slotted part of the valve adjuster, loosen the nut, and then rotate the adjuster accordingly to tighten or loosen it. In this case, we're tightening it because the intake valve is too loose. Once we have that set, we'll tighten the nut and then check it again. So it's still too loose, so we'll repeat and try and make small adjustments at a time. Sometimes you'll realize that you need to go a lot bigger, but you know, it's kind of better just to do it a little bit at a time until you get the feel for it, and you'll know whether you need to go, you know, a large adjustment or just a minute adjustment. So if you think you're satisfied with the tightness of the valve, make sure to hold the screwdriver in place and then tighten the nut. If you don't hold the screwdriver still, then the valve will actually adjust as you're tightening. So make sure to hold it tight, the screwdriver, and then tighten the jam nut. Okay, so I think I'm satisfied, so I'm going to tighten it down there. We'll recheck once it's fully tightened. That feels pretty good. I got a good amount of drag, not too much, not too little. So let's move on to the next valve. Alright, we'll tighten this one up and check it. Make sure to pull the tool off before you check it. Alright, that feels pretty good. Okay, I've shown you the valve adjustment with a special tool, and now here on the front of the engine there's very little room, no room for the special tool. So we're going to do the same thing but with a stubby screwdriver and a 10mm offset wrench. I know it's hard to see what's going on, but I'm doing the same thing as we did on the other valves. The only difference is I'm holding the valve adjuster with the stubby screwdriver, and I'm tightening and loosening the nut with a 10mm offset wrench. Okay, before you get back to installing everything, we need to make sure of one thing for sure, that all your jam nuts are tight. You don't want to leave any of these loose. That'd be a bad thing, super bad, really bad. So make sure before you start putting valve covers back on and all that good stuff that all the jam nuts are tight. So after that, we're just going to speed through the rest of this process. If you want to check out a more lengthy version of reinstalling the valve covers and all that good stuff, the next video, and I'll put a link up here in the window here. But the next video will be the installation and removal and all that good stuff of the valve covers. If you don't need to see all that, that's fine. We're just going to speed through the installation of the rest of the components that we took off. Okay, you've made it this far. What I like to do at this point is just look over everything. The intake is not bolted down yet, so we can still pull it off if we have to. We just want to make sure all the, especially the hard to reach things down here, are connected, the coolant hoses and things like that that we had to remove. We just want to make sure all those are connected, and any connectors that were just difficult to get to, anything that you can find, just take a good look over and make sure all that stuff is connected. And we'll take a look back here in the back too. Most of the stuff, there's only like two hoses that are really hard to get to, but we'll take a look anyway and look here again at the back, make sure those hoses are on, that connector's on there. Like I said, all this stuff is easy to get to. It's just a couple of hoses down here on the bottom that are kind of hard to get to once the intake is bolted back into place. Okay, so most of this is basic stuff, but we're about to get here to the installation of the throttle cables and the cruise control cable. Uh, they only fit one way, so one's larger than the other, and it'll go in the hole, and then you'll kind of pull it up through the slot. The other one's smaller, it'll go through the smaller hole. The main thing is on installation of these cables, and this is something that my old boss from Honda taught me, is that you don't want to have these cables too tight. There shouldn't be tension on the cable between where it mounts to the little bracket here, and then between the linkage here. So I'm just kind of checking right now for the amount of slack. That's what I'm doing right there. So there should be a certain amount of slack. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it needs to be so much that there's no actual tension that's holding the throttle, the throttle plate open at any point. So once we get that set, we'll just go ahead and tighten the nuts down. We can get the rest of the air box and all that good stuff back together, and that's really about it, guys. It's really not too hard if you can um, if you can set the gap on spark plugs. You can adjust valves. It's basically the same thing. There's a lot of work involved in doing the valve adjustment on these 6 cylinders, but it's not hard. It's just time consuming. That's all it is. You will probably spend more time than you need to actually adjusting the valves. You will most likely overthink it the first time you do it, and that's okay. I did it. Everyone that I know, that's just what it is. You think something bad's gonna happen if you don't adjust them exactly perfect. Well, nobody's perfect, and Honda allows you some sort of leeway, and that's why there's a specification between this and this amount of thousandths of an inch. So, don't be scared of it. Just do the best you can. Just get that slight kind of amount of drag that you can. Not too loose, not too tight. Everything's going to be okay. And make sure you get the jam nut tight. That's all I have to say, and we will see you next time. Thanks for watching.